Hello everybody. Last week we looked at how air conditioning systems work on aircrafts, how the air gets cold in those systems. This week we're going to look at how that air gets distributed throughout the aircraft and how that system is related to aircraft pressurization and cabin pressure. From the shop, with hydraulic pumps running in the background, this is plain simple. Alright, just as a continuation from the video of last week regarding the air cycle machine, which is the packs, the air packs that cool the air conditioning units that cool the air and feed it into the cabin. This is from the video of last week. I'm sure you remember and recognize that picture. That air goes through the pressure bulkhead in the back of the airplane and gets fed into a mixed manifold. This manifold spreads the flow and spreads it throughout the cabin. If you look at these two ducts, those two ducts are supplying the cold air from the left and right packs through a pressure bulkhead and connect to this mixed manifold. This mixed manifold is a plenum with an air box that receives air from the air packs, the air conditioning units, and distribute it through ducts throughout the cabin. Now let's look at how that airflow gets distributed throughout the cabin. This is a diagram form of that airflow, that air conditioning system. This is the distribution system. This here are the two ducts coming from the left and right packs. This is the pressure bulkhead. The airplane is pressurized from here forward. It is non-pressurized from here aft. This is where the air conditioning packs are in the aft equipment bay. And this here is the mixed manifold. From that manifold, you have three individual ducts supplying three individual zones in the aircraft. The flight compartment, which is the cockpit, and passenger compartments forward and aft. And this is not the same for every aircraft. This is the case for this particular aircraft, but it's a good example of how these systems work. Obviously, different aircrafts are going to have different setups, different routing of the plumbing and whatever, but different number of zones, but it's pretty much the same principle behind it. Physics are the same. From here you have, from the mixed manifold, you have the intakes, and these here are check valves. These check valves are here in case one of these packs quits working or you turn it off or whatever. You're not feeding air from the mixed manifold back into that pack. This will basically shut off that reverse flow. It's a one-way valve. That's what a check valve is. They allow flow in but not out. From here it gets distributed through three individual ducts to three individual zones. This one here will feed, if you follow that, this one will feed the forward passenger compartment. This one here will feed the aft passenger compartment, and this one in the center will feed all the way forward to the cockpit, the flight compartment. Now that is air being blown in. That air being blown in goes through Gaspers, ducts. The Gaspers, as a matter of fact, hold on for 1 second. Let me show you what the Gasper is. Okay, this is what the Gasper is, or a WEMAC. WEMAC is a manufacturer. This is what you're used to in aircraft cabins, what you're used to using. This is in the PSU, or passenger service unit, overhead next to the reading lights. this is your individual air supply. This is what you're turning on and off and pointing toward you so you can be comfortable. This is what the Gasper is. Here's another example. This is a different example, but it's the same principle. Now this is what they look like on the back side. You have a plenum and you have a duct, a hose, supplying air to each individual Gasper. So that's what the Gaspers are. So you have a combination of Gaspers and ducts, open ducts placed throughout the cabin, supplying this conditioned air into the cabin. Now, the temperature, the whole air conditioning system and the temperature is controlled from the cockpit, from a control panel, dedicated control panel, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like now. Now, if you notice in that picture, there's 3 control knobs for temperatures, one for each one of the zones in this aircraft, and they close the loop by taking temperature readings from 3 individual temperature sensors. And let me show you what those sensors look like now, again in this particular aircraft. Alright, we're in the airplane now, and I'm going to show you the 3 temperature sensors and a couple more things. We are in the back of the airplane looking forward. That's the cockpit. We are in the aft passenger compartment. And in this corner here we have the temperature sensor for the aft passenger compartment. It has a little fan inside to create its own draft, its own airflow. So that sensor, the temperature sensor, is the temperature sensor for the aft passenger compartment. And then we walk into the forward passenger compartment. And here you can see the temperature sensor for the forward passenger compartment. And now we walk into the cockpit, where we have the cockpit's temperature sensor. So those are the 3 temperature sensors for the AC system, and in the overhead control panel right here is the control panel for the air conditioning system. And these are the 3 knobs where you control the temperature for each one of the zones through these knobs right here. So, after reading the temperature from each one of the zones, the controller in the cockpit can dial in with those knobs the temperature in the cabin in each one of those zones, in the cockpit and the 2 passenger compartments. Now, each individual Gasper, its job is for individual passenger comfort. The air that comes out of the Gasper is colder than the overall cabin air. And I'll show you how that is done. In the mixed manifold, there's a dedicated outlet. You have these 3 outlets feeding air to each one of the zones, cockpit and passenger compartments. But there's a dedicated outlet, which is this black line on this diagram, which distributes colder air throughout the cabin to each one of those Gaspers, all the way up to the cockpit, where you have Gaspers dedicated to pilot and co-pilot. That air is colder because it is taken from the mixed manifold straight from the packs here. That's the coldest air you can get before it gets mixed with cabin air. That's why Gasper air is colder than the rest of the cabin air. Now the rest of the cabin air is not as cold because it is getting mixed also with returned air. This air in the cabin gets recirculated gets filtered. Here's recirculation filter. So that air you can't. The cabin is a closed tube. It's a closed air tank. It is a pressurized vessel. So you're pumping air in from the packs, pumping air in, and you're circulating that air. Not all aircraft circulate the air or recirculate the air. This one does. More modern airplanes do recirculate the air to a certain extent. So you have ducts sucking the air out of the cabin. Here's a fan drawing the ambient air, the cabin air from the cockpit, and to draw away the heat from all the instruments and all that from the cockpit into the passenger compartment, and gets sucked out. It gets filtered, and it gets mixed back into the mixed manifold, where it again gets fed out to the cabin. So since the cabin air is getting warmed up by the passengers and all the equipment and all the avionics on the belly of the aircraft and all the electronics and all that, there's a lot of sources of heat. This air is getting warmed up. So it gets drawn out, it gets filtered, and it gets mixed with the cold air coming in from the packs. Gasper air does not get mixed with that. It gets taken out of the mixed manifold here before it gets mixed. So the air, the Gasper air that gets supplied to you individually is colder coming out of here than the air in the cabin. That way you can dial your individual preference at your seat. You can turn this on or off or more or aim it wherever you want. Now we're back in the aft passenger compartment again, and I wanted to show you the back of the PSU, the passenger convenience unit, which is where you have your reading light and your Gasper. This is your individual air-conditioned cold air supply to the individual passengers. And inside of the PSU, this is the back of that Gasper. This is the air hose, the Gasper air supplying that. And this is the hose that comes supplying air all along the length of the PSU to each individual Gasper. There's another one back there. This would be the back of your reading light. This is the air. Now the return air that gets recirculated gets sucked out of the cabin through here. This is the return air duct. That duct runs the length of the cabin. That green one is your Gasper air. You can see the individual taps going to individual Gaspers. This one up here, that is the return air duct. That is where the air from the cabin gets recirculated, and it goes through ducts down under the floor and ducted to the back of the plane to the mixed manifold to be filtered and recirculated into the cabin again. Now, I mentioned that this is the aircraft, pressurized aircrafts are a pressure vessel. That means that you're pumping air in, and if you don't let it out, you're inflating that aircraft to a certain pressure. Obviously, there's a limit to how much air you can pump in here. You have to let some of it out. And this is where we get into the pressurization system. In the beginning, I mentioned that the air conditioning system is related to the pressurization system of the aircraft. This is the part that relates to that. And just as to make sure that we're all on the same page, because plain simple, this channel is dedicated to be an introductory lesson to people who are not experts in the field. So just as an introductory thing, the reason aircrafts need to be pressurized is because as the aircraft goes up higher in altitude, the air is less and less dense. If you go up high enough, you won't have enough pressure in the atmosphere to allow your lungs to function. you won't be able to breathe enough oxygen and give your body enough oxygen to sustain life, to keep you alive. So you lose consciousness, you start running out of air right at about 11, 12,000 feet. Beyond that, you can hardly, there's very little oxygen. So aircraft cabins, obviously, aircrafts are flying much higher than that. The way you stay awake, and everybody stays awake, is because the inside of the airplane gets pressurized it basically gets inflated to mimic the pressure you would have at a much lower altitude. Again, the higher you go, the less pressure there is, the less dense the air is. So when you're flying up here, you need to pump air into the airplane to raise the pressure to mimic the pressure you would have at a much lower altitude. So cabin altitude is the pressure equivalent that you would have at a lower altitude. So regardless of the plane being at 30, 40, 50,000 feet, the pressure you would experience inside of that airplane would be the equivalent of you flying at 7, 8, 9,000 feet. That is where they keep the airplane, the cabin pressurized at. You can dial that pressure down a little and lower the pressure, therefore being the equivalent of flying at a higher altitude, and you're going to feel drowsy and sleepy and whatever. That's from lack of oxygen. You can increase the cabin pressure, decreasing the cabin altitude, and now you're back in the game. Now, with that, I hope that makes sense. Now, the way that the aircraft controls the pressure is the cockpit and the passenger cabin. All this is basically an air tank. If you're pumping air in from the air conditioning packs back here, you're pumping air into the cabin. You need to let the way you regulate that. If you just had a hole on the side of the aircraft and you're pumping air-conditioned air in and the air is free to get out, the pressure in the cabin is going to match the outside pressure. But if you restrict the size of the outlets, you can control the pressure that you build up in the cabin. And the way you control that is through the outflow valves. The outflow valves are a butterfly throttle valve. The butterfly valve that opens or closes and then modulates the rate at which the air from inside the cabin can escape the cabin. So you're constantly pumping air in, and you can open or close and regulate how much of that air is getting out, therefore dialing in the pressure that you have in the cabin. Now the wings are not pressurized. The tail of the airplane is not pressurized. Wherever passengers and human beings are not in, doesn't need to be pressurized. So all of this is pressurized up to here. Anything outside of that is not. So in this particular aircraft, we have two outflow valves. They're electronically controlled from the cockpit, and they have their two computers controlling them. But in this particular aircraft, we have two outflow valves. One is here, and I'll try to go to the airplane. I'll show you where these are at, so you can physically see these in the aircraft. So here's one. This is below the floor. This is not the passenger compartment floor. This is the A bay, the avionics compartment, which is below the passenger cabin. This is below the floor. You would never see this unless you're in maintenance. So here we have the end of the floor of the pressurized compartment, and then it goes up and it goes over the wing, and then it drops back down again to below the cargo compartment back here. So this is one outflow valve, and I'll show you that. The second outflow valve is back here below the cargo compartment in this particular aircraft. And again, we'll go to the airplane in a little bit, and I'll show you those. Now, if you notice here, we have two outflow valves. These are the valves that control the pressure in the cabin pressure, the pressurization of the aircraft. These are the ones that are constantly modulating the air that you're pumping in. These are modulating how much of that air is getting out. These, way back here, are safety valves. In the event that either one of these two valves fail, they will prevent, these safety valves will take over. If either one of these valves do not open and you're overpressurizing the cabin, these safety valves are set to trip open at a certain pressure, and they will open up and vent out to the atmosphere the cabin pressure. These are a backup in case the outflow valves fail. These will also allow air in case the packs, the air conditioning packs, quit working and you're not pumping air into the cabin, and you start at a higher altitude. If you're coming from a higher altitude and the airplane starts coming down, but your outflow valves will not open, and you cannot get, now the aircraft is pressurized at a higher elevation, the higher altitude than the actual aircraft is, than outside pressure. That means that the aircraft has a lower pressure inside of the cabin than the atmospheric pressure outside. That means that you have a negative pressure. The atmosphere is trying to get in, and it's supposed to get in through the packs, but if your packs quit working, now you have a negative pressure here. These safety valves will allow air to get in to the cabin. So these have dual purposes, to prevent overpressurization of the cabin and to prevent negative pressure in case your packs quit working and you need to get air back in to pressurize the aircraft and to equalize it to the outside pressure when you're coming back down again. Now let's go take a look at those outflow valves in the aircraft. Alright, we're back in the outside of the airplane. We're looking at, here's a fuselage, there's the left engine, this is the left wing where it butts up to the fuselage, and this is the pressurized cabin. And now we're going to look at the forward outflow valve. This is the wing box. This is the bottom of the fuselage. Bottom of the fuselage. This is the bottom of the round part of the fuselage, where it steps up to go over the wing. And if we look, this is looking forward. Look at that hole. I'm going to take you up in there. That is the outflow valve. That is the forward outflow valve, which blows into this compartment. Now we're going to go to the back of the airplane and look at the second outflow valve. Now, the astute amongst you are going to notice that this area of the fuselage gets a fairing. So there's a fairing that closes all that in. So you may think to yourself, well, all that air getting pumped into a closed-in area, where does it go? Ultimately, that air that leaves the cabin through the outflow valve flows in through this area and flows in through this area, which below here is a fairing, which closes all this in to keep it smooth. So all that air blows in between the bottom of the wing and that fairing and goes out to the aft equipment bay, and that's where we're going now. Cruising through the bottom of the airplane, this whole area gets vented through the wheel well, all around, not really through the wheel well because there's a wheel bin that goes in here and closes this in, but this whole area gets vented by cabin pressure outflow all through here. We're looking inside of the fairings. All through here we're facing aft. Now we're behind the wing. The wing is up in there. There's the flap carrier. We're looking aft. This here is a fuselage. That's part of the pressurized tube that the fuselage is. So we are below the fuselage, behind the wing, in an area that's normally closed in by fairings, very much like these are. Here's a structure, bulkhead, to support the fairings. Cabin pressure, air getting dumped from the forward outflow valve goes through this area below the aircraft. Let's continue the tour to the back of the equipment bay. Alright. Now we're looking forward again. We are inside of the aft equipment bay, up a ladder. This wall here, now we're facing aircraft forward. Left, right, forward. We're in the back of the airplane. And this is a pressure bulkhead, which comes this way, steps up, and continues up. All that is pressurized. That is the end of the pressurized area of the airplane. From there forward, inside of that is pressurized. From here back, it's not. And if we look through here, that hole, that is your aft outflow valve. And again, what you're looking at is the valve itself, the butterfly that gets modulated to control the amount of air that gets dumped overboard from the pressurized cabin. One more time. Now, we have cabin pressure coming into the aft equipment bay through here, and from the forward outflow valve is flowing back into this same area through the fairing cavity from both sides of the aircraft. And the reason they vent that through under the wing and all that is to keep a constant flow of air carrying away any vapors from greases and hydraulic fluids or fuel. If there's any, in the event that there's any spills, it gets vented with a constant flow of air flowing underneath all that, blowing it back here. And from the aft equipment bay, this whole area gets vented. And again, the aft equipment bay is where we were before looking at the air conditioning packs. And the outlet for all that cabin air that vents all this is those grills on the side. That is the ultimate outlet of cabin air pressure. Again, it goes from here, from the engines or the APUs, through the cooling packs, air conditioning packs, through these ducts, through the pressure bulkhead. This is where the check valves are. Forward of that, you have the mix manifold, and then it goes distributed and recirculated through the cabin, etc., until it eventually gets dumped through the aft outflow valve, which is here, the forward outflow valve, and both of them vent overboard into the aft equipment bay, sweeping under the wing, carrying any vapors, and ultimately leave through that vent, that grill. You have one there, and there's another one on this side. Now let me turn the light off so it can show itself a little better. Anyways, point is, you have two of those, one per side, and I'll show you what they look like on the outside. Alright, now we're looking at another airplane with all the fairings installed, so you can see the comparison, the before and after. This is where we were looking at before, the joint between the left side of the fuselage, the left wing, left engine. Here's that fairing smoothing out the body of the aircraft. And that is the area where the forward pressure outflow valve is, carrying all that air under the wing out into the aft equipment bay. Now we're in the back of the airplane. Again, all that air is coming through all these fairing area. All that gets vented. And it ultimately exits through here. This is one of those outlets on the side of the fuselage. Now we're in the back of the airplane underneath the left engine. And that is how this is the ultimate outlet of cabin air pressure. And again, you have one of these on either side of the engine, on both sides of the engine. On both sides of the fuselage, I'm sorry. There you go. That's thank you for coming along. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's clear and easy enough to understand. I hope you like looking at the guts and the inside, the behind the scenes of how the airplane works. Alright, stay safe guys. See you next time. And now we're back in here just to recap the air conditioning system and the pressurization system. It can be summed up pretty simply here. Starting from the back, we have the pneumatic system, which is comprised of the source of air coming from either left engine, right engine, or the APU. Whatever your source of air is comprises your pneumatic system. That gets selected, whichever your source is, so it gets selected through the flow control system to feed your left and right packs, your air conditioning systems that we talked about last week. Here's your ram air. That's the scoop on the top of the tail, bringing cold air from the outside coming in. All that gets fed into the distribution system, which is that mixed manifold. From there, that the conditioned air gets fed to 3 zones in the aircraft: cockpit and passenger compartment. From there, it gets recirculated back to the ventilation system and fed back into the mixed manifold, where it can make that same loop again. Now, you have all that air coming in. Some of it's getting vented out overboard through the outflow valves, the one in the back of the aircraft and the one in the middle of the aircraft. So you have air coming from the engines or the APU, going through the air conditioning systems, through the mixed manifold, getting distributed throughout the aircraft, getting vented back out again to be recirculated and filtered and redistributed again, and some of it gets controlled and flown. It flows in a controlled manner out of the outflow valves. And over here, you're controlling the temperature, feeding cold air in and mixing it with hot air. And here, you're controlling the pressure that you want to keep in the aircraft cabin. Here's your outflow valves. So this diagram here sums up pretty good the air conditioning system, its flow, and the pressurization system. The in and the out, you're controlling temperature here, you're controlling pressure here. Temperature gets controlled before you feed the air to the cabin. Pressure gets controlled on its way out. You're restricting how much of it leaves the aircraft. That's where you're controlling the pressure. Alright. I know I got a little repetitive, but I hope you found it interesting. Like always, thank you guys for sticking around. Let me know if there's anything else that you're curious about, and I'll try my best to answer your questions. Stay safe and see you next time.